Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the presidential debates, the increasing polarization in American politics, and the Democratic Party candidates for the 2020 elections. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Michael Flanagan, former US Congressman, and Josh Kraushaar, political editor of the National Journal. Thank you so much both for joining me today. We're going to be focusing on the domestic issues of the United States. There's a lot going on. We're seeing the beginning of the debates between Democratic nominees for the presidential elections. I do want to ask you about your opinions on these many different nominees and where they stand. Is it really just tilting and moving towards the left more and more? Is that what we're seeing?
Well, I think we're seeing an ideological divide in the Democratic Party, which is indeed tilted to the left. You're seeing the Democrats, the leading candidates, with the exception of Joe Biden, taking positions on his single-payer health insurance, entitlements for illegal immigrants in the country, racial reparations, busing. Positions that you would never have seen any mainstream candidate in the Democratic Party take in past elections. Now, some of this is, they feel like it's in response to Trump. Some of it is because there's a generational divide where younger Democrats are much more progressive, much more ideologically to the left. But you're also seeing a divide within this field where you have candidates that are either socialist or are running on an extremely progressive agenda. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Kamala Harris, to be honest, is moving in that space as well, as defined by her battle with Biden. But you also have the front runner, Joe Biden, who is definitely running in the same pragmatic space that he always has. And even Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, is also, is pretty liberal, but running a more pragmatic campaign. But the big tell is that Joe Biden is really the only pragmatist, the only moderate in that first tier of candidates. And there's some very accomplished candidates, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Michael Bennet, senator from Colorado, Governor John Hickenlooper, also of Colorado. These are candidates that are very accomplished, very moderate, have a record that really should be selling better, and yet they're only at 1-2% at most in these national polls. That tells you where the mood of the National Democratic Party is. It's more to the left than we've ever seen in quite some time.
What do you think, Michael?
I think that's very true. I think you're very right. But I think it's a larger, more systemic thing, and I'll come to you from the perspective of having been a member of Congress and know how they interacted with each other 25 years ago as opposed to today. It was very civil. It was very pleasant. You could talk to members on the other side. My best friend in Congress, other than Steve Latourette of Ohio, was Bill Lipinski, and we used to talk about all kinds of different things, and the future of the nation, the fate of the nation, things like that. Those conversations don't happen anymore, ever, on either side to either side. It's because as the districts have become more solidly R or D, my battle is in my primary. So if I march to the left, my battle is in the primary. It's not in a general election. So I'm rewarded for marching further left. I also keep primary challenges from my left from happening and Republicans from my right from happening. So there's a great deal of reward of marching to the left. Where years past, you were right. If I had some really lefty view, I would whisper it at fundraisers and other places and say, I'm really with you, but let's not talk about this out loud because I got to go to a general election. I can't be. But now, the people who are going to vote for me, I'm not worried about the middle. I need all of them to vote for me. I got to get mine out and keep his home, and mine need to hear, left, or on the Republican side, right, as you saw with the Tea Party a few years ago. And I think that this is kind of a systemic, a larger problem with the nation as a whole, not just afflicting the Democrats in this cycle. And I think we're going to see more and more of this as time goes on.
It's definitely afflicting both parties, and I think one symptom of the problem is how people consume news and the incentive structure in the media.
Yes.
You look at all the data. The Pew Research Center poll shows that by a large margin, more younger people rely on Facebook or Twitter to get their news. And this is not even; these aren't even news sources. They're aggregators that rely on getting the most partisan, ideological content to unimpressionable people. that how they get their political impressions out there. And then the comedy shows are now much more ideological and not as purely humorous as they once were. So the content, the news content, the entertainment content that people get, it's not from the Washington Post, it's not from the New York Times as much as it was 10, 15 years ago, and the incentive structure is if it sells, if it's extreme, if it's ideologically partisan, then it will get more clicks. And that we're seeing, we thought that was sort of taking place in a separate sphere from politics, but I think we're still sort of reaping what we've seen on social media in the last decade, where some of these views that were out of the mainstream but have gotten traction on places like Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms, that's now trickled down into the world of politics, and a lot of candidates are talking about those issues in that context.
What happened to the American moderates or the traditional Republicans, traditional Democrats? Where are the people who used to vote for these major blocs in this country for the last, I don't know how many decades?
They're still out there. In fact, if you look at all the data that shows how many people identify as liberal, conservative, moderate, it's actually not a whole lot different than it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But the extremes are not just louder than they were, but they have a voice, they have platforms, they have megaphones in social media, for one prominent instance. They have a louder, there's no gatekeepers anymore. So, you don't have the head of the Democratic...
So it's louder, not more.
Right. There's still a bunch of people, you might not realize it watching the news all the time, but you still have a pretty critical mass, sizable mass of undecided swing voters out there that are pretty moderate in their political beliefs. But the people who are Richard Nixon called them in the 60s the silent majority, right? Because they weren't getting as much press attention, but they were a critical part of winning elections. And you're seeing in the polls today there is a pretty significant plurality of people who are more to the middle, but they're not being represented by the two major parties.
What do you think?
I'm going to moderate from you just a little bit on that. I think your observation with the press was correct, and that leads to a place where everyone has more of a sense of team. And I blame CNN for this entirely, and not for the reasons you may think, but they're the ones who invented red and blue in the Clinton election. And this was emblematic. And now it's about team. Reagan carried 49 states in his reelect, and I don't know, something close to that in his original election. W's father carried 40-some states. It's unthinkable today. It's not possible. It's however many moderates decide to show up and say, "I'm sorry, I just can't vote for Mayor Pete. You're crazy," or I'm sorry, I just can't do the Trump thing. You're just nuts. There's not enough of a critical mass to deliver a blue state red, a solid blue state, or a solid red state blue, because of this sense of team. It's not. There's no mass that's willing to be persuaded. It's a tiny, tiny number now, if it ever really existed. What it is folks who identify team first, then candidate. And so I'll vote for the best Democrat, but it's going to be a Democrat. I'll vote for the best Republican, but it's going to be a Republican.
But I will add that you'd be surprised that about 10 to 15% of the electorate voted for Obama and voted for Trump. That makes a difference in almost every presidential election.
But you need about 40% to deliver a state that's willing to move. And that number is a lot smaller today.
So the map is smaller, but you still have to persuade voters that are not necessarily fans of either party, right, or are not in love with Trump, but have some concerns about the direction of the Democratic Party. And we're seeing an election where you're going to have a disenfranchised middle. You're seeing each side trying to do their best to limit their appeal to people in the independent sphere, people who have personal issues with Trump, don't like his tweeting, don't like his character, but look at the Democratic policies, especially what they're hearing from the presidential campaign, and are wondering whether they can afford to support the Democratic nominee if it's someone from the left. So it's a race to the bottom. This presidential election is turning into a race to the bottom.
It could be, but you have much of the same dynamic you had with Hillary in just the mechanics of the election, because Trump's negatives are hard. They're not soft negatives. They're quite hard negatives, like Hillary's were. So this group of people will never vote for him. We'll leave the country. We'll put a gun in their mouth. We'll do anything they have to do. This will never vote for him. And his positives are also quite hard. They're quite rigid. It hangs in the low 40s at best. And every once in a while, some of these groups you're talking about bump him up near 50, but he hangs in the low 40s. If you're hanging below 45, you've got trouble, systemically. And so the left sees that and says his hard ceiling is probably below 45, so I can get crazy, because he's not going to climb over that number easily. And I just can't get too crazy that it drives that number up. And I think that's the plank they're walking.
Well, that's a very important point, that Democrats look at Trump's unpopularity and consistent trading range in that 40 to 45% space, and they think that they can do anything, along the lines of what Trump did, and they'll have a core base of support. But be careful what you wish for, because like the one way you can alienate that 10% of the country is by actually proposing policies that will directly affect the livelihood of the people that you're trying to win over.
Let's talk issues very quickly. And when we saw the Democratic debates, what do you think the issues that were basically the most important things for the American people at this point that were realistically to be delivered? There's a lot of, for example, criticisms of Sanders that he talks about, social justice and big titles, but he does not have the policies that he has to implement, to actually deliver anything to the people. What do you think that was different by other candidates within the Democratic Party that said things were triggering people who need these changes for their daily lives?
So one of the most important questions in that first debate was the one on how you're going to get your agenda passed. And that is the dilemma especially for the progressive wing of the party. And none of the candidates, especially Warren, had a convincing or persuasive answer. The challenge is to win the House, to hold the House for the Democrats, and to win the Senate, you need to win states and districts in conservative-leaning territory. You cannot win. If you just campaign with a message geared toward Blue America, you're going to have a small minority in the Senate, and you're going to lose the House.
But isn't that what they're doing exactly?
So the challenge for someone like Warren is if she campaigns on her message in a general election, they're not going to win, but Republicans are going to hold the Senate, certainly. And if she won, it would be on a very polarizing election, very narrowly, in all likelihood. So she's not going to have the votes in the Congress for her agenda. McConnell was probably, even 50 votes, even if Democrats did take back the majority, the likelihood of passing a sort of a sweeping agenda to the left on issues like healthcare, on issues like taxes, is extremely, extremely unlikely. So there is a point where you have to wonder, when the rubber hits the road, do Democrats actually have a plan? Elizabeth Warren has a lot of plans, but does she have a plan to get her agenda and have any chance of it getting through Congress?
There's no way to pay for a tiny fraction of what they've talked about on a practical level. And so they really don't have a plan to move any of this through Congress. And this is the great value of being a Republican, is that our job is just to make sure nothing ever happens. So, because we like things how they are, and change and progress is not something we want because it's expensive and it changes the nation. So Republicans like to leave it alone. And so when Nancy says it's a do-nothing Congress, that's an appeal to our base. We like that. That's good. You haven't done it. I don't have to be afraid of what you're doing. That works out well. But when they talk about opening the borders, and they all seem to be for that. In fact, some of the smarter commentators have actually said, yeah, it is. It's just open borders. And then lavishing health care and all of these other issues, all these other very expensive things on folks who would come here otherwise illegally, unless the legislation deems them not illegal here anymore. You have open borders. There's a real question of not just how to pay for it, but whether it's right to do that. And this is a question that's not being much discussed in the public sphere right now, but it's a question Republicans love to go back to, is that even if we could pay for this, is it the right thing to do? Is this something we should be doing? Is this good policy?
Does that work for our country?
Right. And so Trump's challenge will be, and individual candidates in their district challenge will be, to move the conversation away from the practical issue, as important as that is, because it really is a good one, because there's no way to pay for this stuff. But to then go say, and even if we could pay for it, is this the right thing to do? Is this and get people thinking like that. That's a tougher challenge to break through the din and the noise to get that done. And I don't know if that's going to happen. But if that happens, the Republicans will landslide through the election. And that's I think, going to be their challenge coming.
Some people are looking at the Democratic Party today, and they're saying that this party is becoming more and more a minorities party. It's not a party that's representing everybody in the United States, but really just focusing its attention on getting minority votes. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, look, there's more racial polarization than we've seen in any time in modern history, in that you have a larger share of the Republican Party essentially being older white voters, and Democrats having a much more higher proportion of non-white voters. So that creates a very unstable political situation, because you're not talking about economic issues. You're not talking about sort of issues you can find a middle ground on. When you're talking about issues about your values, about your identity, it's hard to find somewhere in the middle that everyone can agree on. I mean, on the issue of immigration, to that point, there used to be, not that long ago, sort of a bipartisan consensus on immigration that we wanted to have people come into the country legally, and we also emphasized assimilation, right, adaptation, that you kind of have a certain set of values. You want to be American, and you assimilate as part of the American melting pot. And that was something that Democrats and Republicans alike articulated pretty clearly. Now you have a Republican president who, frankly, doesn't want the immigration at all. Like I think he's skeptical of legal immigration, and you have a Democratic Party that doesn't even pay a nod to the notion that legal immigrants, have a responsibility to assimilate and become part of the larger American society. So that's an example of just we are so polarized. We are so heading to the extremes on a core issue that a lot of people feel strongly about. I don't know how we get back to the old normal of believing in assimilation, of believing in a healthy level of legal immigration, and finding seeing America as a shining beacon on the hill, as many candidates and presidents of both parties were talking about.
Michael, I do want to ask you about this issue, about the legal immigration. I mean, even the Obama administration was doing some actions to restrict illegal immigration in a very similar way to the Trump administration. Nobody talks about that in the media. I mean, I know that there's a spotlight on the way people have been treated on the borders. This is a very sensitive and very saddening things to see. But were those things happening before, during the previous administration, we were not learning about it?
Well, as we're seeing with many of the Democrats' own behavior in the House, particularly, the pictures that they show are from the previous administration, where these activities have been going on for a very long time.
From the previous administration,
right? Okay. But you don't have what you didn't have then, at least not to the degree you have now, is the enormous numbers of people coming. To pull in 1.5 million a year was a big year. We're doing half that a month now. And this is, George Soros is working out there with the Fronteras and the others out of Chicago and elsewhere. Perhaps not. I don't know.
To do what?
To drive folks north. I think that there's a possibility of that happening.
It's such a conspiracy theory, right?
Well, it's not really. It's the money's being spent there. The Archdiocese of Chicago and others are proud of the money they're spending. They brag about it. But the complexity of that also is that we've also set up a situation in these countries where they've become, for lack of a better word, plantations, where we turn them into dependent economies to selling to us, whether it's coffee, bananas, what have you, and eroded the skills with the corruption in their own country. So there's a lot of unemployed people who are never going to be employed in that country. And if I'm a young guy and I've got a new family and I know that I will never have a job, but I will be living my entire life on a handout from the government to keep me quiet and upset, I'm going to find some place to go. So these folks running north, I don't think ill of them at all, not one tiny bit. But that doesn't mean we need to open the borders. And this is the problem, is we need a better solution for this harder problem than just saying, okay, come on in, because we've got to get to a better place.
Like a fundamental social. What would you make of what Michael
There's
just
an
said?
administrative dysfunction that we didn't see in the Obama administration. And the Obama administration did have different policies. They deported people here illegally, but they had a specific focus on people who were criminals or had violations, criminal violations or legal violations. So there was a different priority. Now, Jay Johnson, Obama's DHS secretary, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post decrying the way his party is moving far left on the issue and not tried to find compromise. Because look, there needs to be more judges. The congressman's right that the flow has increased in the last year, and there are not enough judges to handle the case of migrants. The bureaucracy is totally at a gridlock, and there needs to be a more, I think, effective president would reach across the aisle, and Democrats would do the same to get money to the border, would actually try to. Ted Cruz has been an outspoken advocate on getting more judges to handle these cases that are being backlogged. I think they're like about 700,000 a year. It's just too much for the system to handle.
Yes.
But I think the administration, and this is where Trump is different than Obama, I think there's a political impetus for there to. I think Trump feels like it helps him to see this chaos, to see these pictures of migrants crossing.
Why
the
is
border.
that appeal to his
disagree
block
with you
of
just a little
voters?
bit.
What do you think, Michael?
Trump has twice offered Congress a huge number of the DACA kids, much more than his own party was willing to contemplate, and to try and find some middle ground. He encourages Congress regularly to provide him a piece of legislation that he's willing to sign off on. And he hasn't been brutal about, no, not that this, or not that this. They've provided nothing.
Well,
Congress has produced no legislation that even for any kind of discussion. And this is Congress's job. This is not the president's job. It's not Obama's job. It's not Trump's job. They're stopgap filling it in because Congress refuses to do it. The last fundamental immigration bill that was passed was one that I voted for, and it was real soft on European immigration, real hard on other immigration, but it paid for a wall, which never got built. It paid for, and it was virtually bipartisan event as well. It wasn't virtually, it was absolutely bipartisan, but it was virtually unanimous vote that came through. We have changed. Fundamentally, we have changed. But I'm not laying this at the feet of Trump, and I don't think it's fair to do that. I think this is Congress's problem, and they failed abysmally.
So in 2018, there was the outline for a deal where Democrats wanted the legalization of children of illegal immigrants that have been in the country for quite some time in exchange for border security, right? That seems like an obvious deal, but there were restrictionist forces at the top levels of the White House that also wanted reductions in legal immigration. They put poison pills, they proposed things that they knew Democrats couldn't stomach, and frankly, were not particularly popular with the broader public.
Well,
so,
but those poison pills.
Can you
So, I mean, there was an
elaborate a
outline.
little bit more about this?
Yeah, there was in 2018 when we were debating the issue of immigration. There was an obvious deal to be had. Democrats wanted to protect the status of children of illegal immigrants called dreamers, which if you look at the polls, that has widespread support. And Republicans wanted more money for the border to deal with these migrants, to streamline the process in ways that Republicans could support. And that was support. Jared Kushner, for example, was I think supportive of that general outline.
Yeah.
But there are other members at the top levels of the administration, Stephen Miller probably the most prominent of them, that also wanted to add provisions that would reduce legal immigration, that would do essentially poison pills that were not popular, were very polarized, and that would be
not work with Democrats.
tangential to a possible compromise. And that's where I argue that I think that the Republicans, not only do they have a more restrictionist view in this administration towards regular immigration, but they also view the issue of immigration as a political asset. They know that these images, Democrats may think that they draw people's compassion, but there are a lot of Americans that do feel like we need to have better border security, that we can't have open borders. Yeah. And I think there are elements of this administration that think it's a political asset. They have an asset an advantage on the issue.
To want to restrict chain migration is technically talking about current legal immigration. I'll give you that. But the numbers of people in this country who are in favor of chain migration is near zero. These were not controversial or difficult, and certainly not poison pills that were put in there. This was part of the package that the White House wanted, that Republicans have wanted, and a lot less than Republicans have wanted for a long time. The point I was trying to make was that Congress's responsibility is to produce a bill. Mrs. Pelosi has control of the chamber. She can produce any bill she wants to. Once that bill is produced, she needs to push it through the Senate, or the Senate needs to produce a bill and push it through the House.
But this is before Democrats won the House.
Okay, but then we can go back to Ryan, and we can discuss that all you like, and I'll be glad to discuss that with you now until any time. The point is, Congress's job is to produce a piece of legislation. The one thing Obama did right with the Affordable Care Act, which I think is just one of the most horrible things that's ever happened to this country, but from the president's point of view, the one thing he did right was we call it Obamacare, but he didn't write that. He went to Nancy and Harry and said, you guys need to write a bill. And in these very broad parameters, whatever you write inside, I'll sign. Trump has done essentially the same thing and has thrown on a much higher number of DACA kids and other stuff that the Republicans would have a hard time following, but the Democrats would love. And it's too big a give for the too little the Democrats were offering to give against it. And that's the problem.
Let's move to, stay within the Congress, but move to the Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Cortez, big dilemma with the president, and obviously their dilemma since being appointed. There's many different scandals, especially about Ilhan Omar, comments about Al-Qaeda, refuses to denounce the group. There's some videos of her interviewed and basically, somehow making fun of people criticizing Al-Qaeda or being against Al-Qaeda. I mean, there are some question marks there, but now there's criticisms to the president because of the way he handled this, and he basically made some comments that were offensive to some people. I want to hear your opinion on this.
Well, look, the tweet that the president sent out over the weekend, among other, I think, offensive things, engaged in the trope, go back to where you came from. And assuming he was referring to these four members of the squad, the most progressive left-wing members of the House, three of them were born in the United States of America. Only one was born outside of the country. And that trope has been used against African Americans, has been used against Jews, been used against other people as a slur. And you could say Trump didn't know what he was. Sometimes maybe he's tweeting and doesn't understand the history of the rhetoric he uses. But I think you're the president. You have a responsibility to use better rhetoric and to actually engage in a mature conversation. Now, the people members he's referring to, and Omar he mentioned on numerous occasions after the original tweet. I mean, she has also engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. All About the Benjamins was the tweet she put out to decry Jewish or pro-Israel influence in the Congress. She seemed to dismiss the evil of Al-Qaeda. I mean, you can interpret the video that she said a few years ago the way whatever you like. But
Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, like she was, yes.
She seemed to think that we took Al-Qaeda too seriously. Like we kind of use it to. I think maybe she would say we use it to. Some people, right? I mean, she's very, very cavalier.
Yeah, even when she talked about 9/11, she was like, some people did something about.
And I don't think. I mean, Tlaib is someone who has participated, or at least been involved in a Facebook group where some of the most vile anti-Semitic imagery has been perpetrated. I don't know if she saw it or not, but this is something that hasn't gotten a whole lot of press coverage.
She's been using these images in her Twitter feed.
Well, I don't know, but I know that Tlaib is a member of a Facebook group where some of these, frankly, explicitly anti-Semitic images have been shared, right? So, I mean, they're not very popular members of Congress, let's put it mildly, and they've engaged in their own, at least a couple of them have engaged, or at least participated in some pretty bigoted behavior. But, you're the president, right? And one wrong, two wrongs don't make a right. And I think the president was trying to sort of change the terms of the debate after the fact. But he did tweet what he did, and it was not just offensive, but it was a bigoted tweet, and he hasn't apologized and he hasn't backed down.
So this is, I think, I mean, this is an ongoing issue, but in terms of the American public views, where do you think the American people really stand on this? Because, we see on Twitter, there's a war on Twitter, right? And we see these pages of representatives like Ilhan Omar, like Rashida Tlaib. They have quite a number of following. They have quite a number of people who put likes on their thing. Obviously not as much as the president, and there's other people on the other side also, but what's going on in terms of the American public seeing this as becoming a normal thing, for somebody to not be very favorable of our country, but yet be accepted as a member of the Congress, even though they embrace and like enemies of the United States, like, for example, Maduro, but that's completely acceptable.
Well, look. Politically, there's a reason why Nancy Pelosi has gotten into essentially a war with these four members. It's because Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker, is worried that their views are not just deeply unpopular with Republicans, but they're very deeply unpopular with a lot of independents and even a lot of Democrats. Omar, in particular, I know in the Jewish community, a lot of Democrats I've talked to have profound misgivings about her worldview and her ideology. So these are Democrats.
And this is why the Republicans are furious with Trump, because they took an internecine war and made it an international one for no reason. Right. Just let them fight, and I have to get involved.
Right.
Please, just let it alone.
When you make things about Trump, everything is about Trump, and Trump is not popular, right?
Yeah.
So anytime Trump inserts himself in a winnable, in a development that favors the Republicans, it's not going to be advantageous. So that's why, I mean, they're not broadly popular. They're popular with a small subset of the Democratic base, and they're a very vocal subset of that Democratic base.
Loud one that you were talking about.
Yeah, the Twitter Democrats.
You're so correct, but I think it's even more focused than that. It's 750,000 people in a discrete corner of this country put them in their job. And AOC particularly is not enjoying the numbers in the Bronx that she thinks she ought to have. Her Twitter following doesn't vote for her. It's the people in New York, and she's kind of ignoring them, and those numbers are not looking good. Omar in Minnesota is having a similar difficulty, even among a base that's fairly radicalized to begin with. They don't like the light that's being shined on them by this sort of activity. leave us alone, we're nice, quiet bigots. And the answer is, I don't want to have to defend you or discuss you out loud. And so that narrow slice is either going to send them back or keep them away. And I think in the case of at least two of them, they've got a very difficult fight to return next fall.
Yes, and we do have the elections, coming up. What do you expect we're going to see for these very controversial representatives of the Congress today?
So of those four, and I think they're all in safe Democratic seats. The battleground is in the primary, as you well know.
Absolutely.
Tlaib actually won by the narrowest of margins, and she actually represents a majority African American district, and she ran against numerous African American opponents, and she mobilized largely the Arab community in that Dearborn district. She may have a rematch against a one-on-one rematch against an African American opponent in a district where, speaking of identity politics, people generally vote their identity, and that would make Tlaib very vulnerable if the woman she ran against last time runs again. As far as Omar goes, I think she's in a little bit of a better shape just because she's such a high-profile figure on the left. Her district is extremely, it's Minneapolis, very, very, very progressive. And it's hard for the Democrats to find one candidate that really is strong enough to take her on, even though they privately may want someone more mainstream. And AOC and Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, I think they have their seats as long as they want them. I will say, though, New York is losing 2 congressional seats as part, in all likelihood, as part of reapportionment. So if Nancy Pelosi wants to punish AOC, there could be a way to take her congressional seat away in the 2022 election. But that's not until 4 years from now.
Exactly, not until 4 years from now.
I agree with you about Presley, but I think AOC is in more trouble. And I think Omar will be replaced with a clone. But I think she herself is in trouble with her own party there.
And I just want to
it's not a more moderate Democrat that's going to replace them. Someone very much seeing them, but not them.
Well, this is from your time in Congress. Cynthia McKinney was a Democrat who was sort of like Ilhan Omar in the 90s. She was someone who ended up running, left the party of the Democrats, became a Green Party presidential candidate. And she was challenged and she won one time, then I think she lost. She came back. You couldn't quite get rid of her. But I think there could be a similar situation in Minnesota where you have someone more mainstream.
My question would be now about, right now we are talking about representatives of the Congress who are very sympathetic to the Iranian regime. We know from Ilhan Omar, from Tlaib, these are representatives who sympathize with rogue regimes like the Iranian regime, like the Venezuelan regime. But that also is a theme that we're seeing generally within the Democratic nominees for president.
Well, I don't think they sympathize with rogue regimes as problematic, I think, as their worldview is. I think we've seen there's a long line in American history of very far left members of Congress who basically view America as a force for evil,
exactly,
right? Or a force, a negative, I shouldn't say a force, but a negative force. And whatever they do overseas is always a problem. It's colonialism. And certainly Omar, and I think probably AOC is in that same camp. So so the defense of Maduro isn't because there's a love of Maduro. It's that any American intervention is horrible. Like, we shouldn't be involved in any other countries.
But the result is the same, because they're advocating for, let's leave these evil dictatorships killing their own people. This is not of our business, right?
Look, I agree.
As long as the dictatorship is a left-wing dictatorship.
Yeah.
I agree. The policy views are pretty radical, but especially at a time when Democrats are accusing Trump of consorting with Iraq, I think we have to be careful, to not say that they're actually working together. The policy may end up helping. The views may end up empowering dictators. You could also say the same thing of Trump and meeting with the North Korean dictator, and you can make the same argument on the other side. So I just think that their worldview is very radical. There's a long line on the left of these type of views that whenever America intervenes overseas, they're not doing the right thing. They support regimes that are not very savory. But I do think that I don't think they're palling around with Maduro, or I would hope not, at least.
You're right. It's interesting. I like to watch the people on the edges of the Democratic power structure. The Republicans are more transparent with this because we have to be, because you guys love to write about us. So we don't have a chance to have kind of people who donate and never get discussed and things like that. All Republicans are dragged into the light all the time. But this week I saw both Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel go after presidential candidates, calling them names, or Emmanuel called the gang there, the squad names, I'm sorry.
Punk, snot-nosed punks.
Punk, snot-nosed punks. And this is orders from headquarters. These guys are not working on their own. This is from Obama Central. This is from the hierarchy of the party trying to guide it to a place where we can get a nominee to beat Trump, rather than whatever happens happens. And so there's some hands coming involved in this from the edges that are fun to watch if you know the signs to look for. And anytime Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel show up with the same voice in the same week doing the same thing, they were pushed out to do this. I'm sure they're perfectly willing to do it. I'm sure they believe this too. But they're speaking at this moment was we need to influence this. We need to get this going in the right direction. I think the Obamas, I understand anyway, I don't know this, but I understand they put their arms around Kamala Harris and think that she's the most likely and best one to beat Trump. And again, it's not the best candidate, it's the one that they think can beat Trump the best, can put together the right number of votes. There's no better vote counters than the Chicago guys. And I think that's their view. And it may turn out to be so.
They know politics better than almost anyone, and I don't think they're doing it just to make their point. I mean, I think they really are worried about the future direction of the Democratic Party. You know, if AOC is the face of the party, there's been plenty of polling showing Democrats lose in the suburbs. They lose ground in these areas that Trump picked up in the 2016 election. So they know this firsthand. That Rahm Emanuel ran the congressional committee in the year they took back the House in 2006. So this is not just done out of disliking these members. It's about political reality.
Well, when we talk about, you know, having these weird relationships or views of dictatorships, we know that also Putin's favorite candidate in this election is Tulsi Gabbard, or at least this was reported online by many different outlets. And I want to hear your views. We know that Tulsi Gabbard is the one who actually went and met with Bashar al-Assad of Syria and has a lot of views that were viewed very positively by Russia. What do you think of her chances? I mean, you saw the debates too, and she keeps talking about the regime change wars, which we only know one that happened in Iraq. But since, I mean, she keeps repeating it even about the Obama administration's approach to the Assad regime, which was never the case.
Well, she's sort of the inheritor of this sort of leftist anti-intervention. Any war is bad. America intervention overseas inherently is horrible. She's sort of in that Ilhan Omar camp on these issues, to the point where, as you said, like she met and has defended, kind of bizarrely, Bashar al-Assad, hasn't condemned in moral terms, at the very least, the gassing of Syrian citizens. So it is sort of moral. I talk to Democrats, and even publicly they'll say that morally she's jumped the shark. That she just, you know, of all they could support almost any one of the candidates on stage, but Tulsi Gabbard has just totally lost it in her views about foreign policy. And look, Ilhan Omar and some of these members we've talked about aren't that far away from that ideological camp. But Gabbard is the one running for president, and she's gotten this platform that a lot of Democrats are just very concerned about.
The Democrats have a problem with Trump's foreign policy, in that it's their dream foreign policy. He engages almost nowhere, and when he does, it's with sanctions and all the ordinary ways they do it. They were almost counting on him helping to invade Syria after the bombings, after the gas attack, and it was a one-off thing. It happened, it was done. I think it took twice-off thing, and happened, it was done. There was no mountain of Marines that marched in after it to solve that problem. The same in Iran, you know, oh my goodness, good, and we're finally going to get the hot war we want that we can hang him with, and it's not going to happen. He is a big fan of not doing this. Unfortunately for the country, actually, not just the Republicans, but for all of us, his plan is thoughtful, and it's going to get us to where we want to be, I think, in the case of Iran anyway. With Maduro, we give it to the South Americans and let them manage it, let them run it, let them drive the train, and we'll kind of shepherd and watch it. And kind of pretty much hands off everywhere else. They'd love to see us interventionist here or there because it makes the argument stronger, but they haven't got much to hang on. So they got to kind of stand on their own with this, and it's not working out.
On foreign policy, Trump has had something of a schizophrenic foreign policy, where his rhetoric doesn't often match his administration's policies. Or
as most businessmen work, you say one thing, you do the other because it's effective.
But I mean, on the issue of, like, if you told me a couple years ago that an American president would be like calling the North Korean dictator his friend and having these chummy, you'd be just, I mean, it's almost the equivalent of some of the stuff Gabbard has said about, you know, meeting with Bashar al-Assad, but he's doing it publicly and he's being cheered for it in certain circles. So I mean, there is a sort of, the difference is though that the policy, even on North Korea, you have hawks like John Bolton, the national security advisor, and Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who don't view North Korea with maybe the rose-colored glasses that Trump sometimes does. But there are, on foreign policy, Trump has engaged in a very different foreign policy in many ways than his predecessors, and it's, you know, on a moral level, a lot of people find it very troubling.
I want to ask you, Michael, and Josh, obviously, what do you think the Democratic position is on Israel now? We see that there's a change within the Democratic Party. There, in general, we see, you know, lenience with the Iranian regime, and when we see in the opposite towards Israel, which is really disturbing to many people, knowing the alliance between the United States and Israel, and obviously the type of regime that we have in Iran. What is going on in that situation? I want to ask you, Michael, first, and then Josh.
Okay. We've declared all but a formal alliance with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE and the Gulf states and Jordan. And these were many of the great militators, great functionaries, keeping tensions with Israel high. Part of that alliance and the sale of arms, or insofar as the arms can be sold with the Senate, the sending of military hardware there, the deploying of the Fifth Fleet, the B-52s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and our common enemy in Iran in a sanctions way. Part of the give back on that has been institutional tolerance for Israel has had to increase by these states that have not always been very friendly. Across the region, I think it's a state-by-state, country-by-country view still. And the closer you get to Israel, the larger the friction is. But Hezbollah, you know, Hamas, these other institutional problems for Israel are not going away. And Hezbollah, for example, is one of the largest problems that the Arab states have with the Persian state, with Iran, is Hezbollah reaching out and creating hegemony in the region, fighting their proxy war in Yemen, and doing the work that they don't. They just seized a ship on its way to send arms to the Houthi in Yemen. They're poking each other quite materially and quite dangerously, and keeping Israel on the sideline, as we're there, kind of keeping an honest broker, is a very healthy thing for all concerned. But they're not viewed as the enemy or as part of the problem. I think they're almost disengaged from the Iran-Saudi thing, in the sense that they are not picking a side. Of course, they have to pick a side.
But Israel has been targeting the Iranian militias in Syria.
In Syria.
IRGC forces,
in Syria,
yeah.
yes. But see, Iran is trying to have it both ways. Oh, we're not. They do what they do. You know, we kind of have something to do. No. You get your orders from headquarters from Tehran. We know you do, and so Israel calls their bluff on that, and so they can say it, but they can't say it. They kind of they have to work on both sides of the face.
But in a democratic, I'm just talking about like the views within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there's a vocal. I mean, this is an issue where, you know, 70 to 80% of Americans overall support Israel Israel over the Palestinians. They recognize that the Palestinians are not a partner for peace, that have started terrorist attacks against the Israeli public and don't recognize its right to exist. They get the fundamentals. But there's a very relatively small, but again, vocal minority within the Democratic Party that has an outsized influence in these primaries. And you can see, if you go on the campaign trail, there's this group, which I don't recall their name. It's maybe got a couple dozen members, but they harass the presidential candidates and insist them on video camera to basically say how horrible Israel is. And it's been a very awkward situation for folks like Cory Booker, you know, Elizabeth Warren, you know, these candidates that have generally had pro-Israel voting records in the Senate or in Congress, but have been kind of ambushed by these camera people. And these
yes, I saw the one with
candidates feel like they have to take a very extreme position, being critical of Israel's very existence, being the only Jewish state in the world. And that's not a tenable place for the Democratic Party to be. Warren and Sanders have been on the forefront, I think, of being more critical of Israel, of supporting some of these groups that don't wish Israel success. And then you have folks like Kamala Harris, who's sort of trying to have it both ways. You know, she spoke at AIPAC, which is, you know, the Israeli pro-Israel interest group, but then she didn't want to speak, you know, during the presidential campaign, and then, you know, it's kind of gone back and forth on a lot of these issues. I think, you know, pro-Israel groups within the Democratic Party view Harris more favorably than Warren and Sanders. They certainly view Biden favorably. He has a pretty strong record of support, and, you know, folks like Klobuchar, Bennett, the moderates in the race have all been on record as supporting Israel. But, you know, this is an example. This is an issue where you know, this is a fringe. You know, maybe 10 to 15% of Americans have a very critical view of Israel, but you see these loud, vocal activists that are putting pressure on the most leftmost candidates, and it is having an impact in the Congress and on the presidential campaign.
And it's more loud, like you said, because of probably social media.
Well, and Omar and Tlaib, I mean, these are the candidates who I think both of them support this thing called BDS, which is essentially of all the rogue countries in the world, they've decided to focus on the lone democracy in the Middle East of Israel, which is just, I think most Americans view that as absolutely backwards. But you have these two vocal members in Tlaib and Omar that have this very extreme view, and they're getting all this national attention, and it's percolating up to the presidential campaign. So it's a big challenge because, I mean, look, pro-Israel voters, a lot of them are Jewish voters, evangelical voters. It's a wide group of Americans, but a lot of them are in these important states. You know, you have a large Jewish population in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, Florida, certainly, and Florida, these are the battlegrounds. So Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, and Democratic leadership, from Emanuel, I'm sure, is kind of just agape, having his jaw agape at some of the rhetoric coming from the campaign.
My last question would be about Joe Biden. Where is Joe Biden in this election? Because there's criticisms of, you know, of his history on different issues. Racial issues, women, Me Too movement issues, you know, but still he is the prominent, most, I think, expected actual candidate for the Democratic Party. But is that what we're going to be seeing? What's happening there? Quickly, and we're probably going to have to cut
his strategy is the right one. He's playing to the half, maybe even like the clear majority of the party that does not identify with the far left. The problem is he's 76 years old. He'll be 78 if he's elected president. And he hasn't shown the same crispness on the campaign trail that he did when he was vice president. So ultimately his team's strategy is the right one. But he's never been a strong candidate for the presidency, and he's dealing. You know, he's old. He's older. He's almost 80 years old. So those two things are kind of clashing with each other. His best hope is that the progressive vote splits and splinters between Warren, Sanders, and Harris, and he's considered the reliable kind of workhorse that's been there for the party. But look, he's a weak front runner. He's
a weak front runner. Who could take him?
I think Harris is would be my bet.
Talking about, Michael.
I think
very quickly.
I think we're waiting for Joe to quit. And I don't think he's that moderate, and I don't think he's been painting himself lately as that moderate. I think his quote earlier this week was, you know, there should be no borders, or I don't love borders. No borders are good borders. Joe is the Democrats' Trump. He's a gaffe machine. He's an accomplished individual. He's slightly left of center. Trump is slightly right of center. He's no right-wing crazy. Joe's no left-wing crazy. He'll say what comes into his mind, and it'll come out wrong, and people will laugh with him. They'll accuse Trump of being an evil racist, but they'll laugh with him. The point is that they see in Biden a lot of what got Trump elected, and there's a certain magnetism around that. But I don't think it's his age that'll kill him, although it ain't going to help him. I think Biden's ancient record of years and years and years of being here and there and back again is going to break his back. For me, I think that's actually a sign of growth and intelligence, that your views evolve over time. But for most people, particularly the press, forgive me, you got to be the same all the time, and you got to be right all the time. And, and he's going to be wrong so much of the time.
30 years ago, you said something.
Exactly. And so I think that's what's going to hang him in the end.
I was going to say that may be the case, though.
Yeah.
On the issue of busing, like talk about an old issue,
Yep.
it's Harris who took an old position.
Yep.
That
And a wrong one.
Democrats thought that issue of mandatory busing was sort of very unpopular back in the 70s and 80s. It was a very, very polarizing issue, and she was the one who sort of revived it. Short term, it did her well. I don't know if that's going to help her long term.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Thank you so much, both. That was a great discussion. I'd love to
Anytime.
have you again.
Thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.